The dungeon. For some of you, you may already know what that is. It was a randomly generated labyrinth where players could enter and fight through random hordes of mobs and search for an artifact deep inside. Once collected, players had to retrace their steps and escape before they were crushed inside. Players who complete the dungeon were rewarded with the artifacts that they could sell for money, as well as the loot that they obtained during the run. Behind me is the original dungeon, Dungeon version 1. The original dungeon was planned to be a 10 by 10 room dungeon that would randomly generate with a start, an artifact room, and one shop. Throughout the dungeon were randomly chosen rooms of different rarities where players could loot and fight mobs. Before we get into how Dungeon version 2 works, I want to go about how Dungeon version 1 works, and the drawbacks that came with making a project like this. Dungeon version 1 was pretty simple for what it did. It randomly generated a maze through the exact same system I used for Dungeon V2. It will randomly move throughout the plane that it can, and once it hits a wall and it can't spread anymore, it will retrace until it can spread again. Now, for Dungeon version 1, that worked pretty good, but it left with some bugs that come pretty noticeable as you see when the maze generates. One of the major ones was the end room was always around the first split of the dungeon. In front of me, you can see a dungeon that I've loaded, and the end room is one split away from the start. And that's because the way I load the end room in Dungeon version 1 is it would spread, but once it hits the first spread that it can't spread anymore, that is the one it chooses for the end artifact room. Once it does that, it retraces, so you get dungeons that look like this, where it's very one side where the start and end are, while most of the dungeon you would never need to explore. Another drawback of Dungeon version 1 is it looked pretty boring. Each room had about 6 variants, and of those 6, there was rarities attached to them, which means that you would see some variants very rarely and some variants really commonly. Alongside that, the variants were very small and cramped. It was a sewer. It was supposed to be small, it was supposed to be a challenge for when you're attacking, but in the end, it led players to get a pretty lackluster experience. The Dungeon version 1 also only had 6 variants for each room. That was 6 lines, 6 turns, 6 endpoints, and 6 T's, along with 1 shop and 1 artifact room. That was it. To show you what I mean, I'm going to be entering Dungeon version 1. Inside, you can see that most of the rooms looked about the same. Ahead, you'll see a little bit variation, but in the end of the day, this was not impressive. It was a sewer, again. It was cramped, small, and it was meant to just pose a challenge for players fighting waves. Another thing Dungeon version 1 lacked was loot. In front of me is the entire loot table of Dungeon version 1. You had about 10 barrels, 10 random items, 10 floor things that would just add some variation, as well as this random line of more just variation. This was boring. It also took a long time to load into the dungeon because the way I was loading it was these rooms had armor stands inside, and when they got cloned into the dungeon, it would target the armor stands and load the loot. The way I did this was very bad. You would have about 100 to 200 armor stands loaded. It would target every single armor stand, give it a scoreboard value, and then from its scoreboard value, load in the loot corresponding to it. If you guys don't know, targeting about 100 to 200 entities at the exact same time with commands, much less set block and clone commands, causes a pretty bad lag spike, and that was one of the main problems that I would have to solve moving on to Dungeon version 2. But what is Dungeon version 2? I know you guys saw a little clip of it at the start, but we're going to go into detail on how it works, the challenges that I came when making it, as well as all the new technical advancements that come with it, allowing me to expand it even today, where this one was locked in, so you only get like 6 rooms per segment. Well, the other one I can just keep adding segments and the computer will figure it out. Now, before you guys freak out, this is the new commands for Dungeon version 2. And this is only the commands for generating the dungeon. It is a lot more than before, but it is way more robust than the first one, and there's a reason there's a lot more going on, because about every single aspect from Dungeon version 1 to 2 has been expanded upon. Let's go over what was changed. For starters, there are more rooms, and I mean lots of more rooms. Each segment on the new dungeon has about 12 variants. These are all independently controlled, and more variants can be added as I see fit. Another thing you may notice is these variants are a lot larger and a lot more decorated. We're going to look at the straightaway variants and just see how each one looks. When going inside a variant, you will see there's again more detail, more hazards, and it's not as straightforward as you would see in Dungeon V1. These variants also oppose a new challenge, which is players can fall in and they cannot escape. The water is not just like you walking through it, it's actually a challenge that you will have to dodge through. But you can also use it as your advantage to push mobs into the exact same trap that might trap you. Each room is independently checked by the computer over there to know how rare it is and what type of variant it is. As you can see, every room has a little marker on the corner, which is Dungeon V2. Eyes are what I call these, like straightaways. These are L's, these are T's. And in all of these, you can have a command block that sets a rarity. As you see, 15 is %. This one will probably go down to 10. And this one might be 1 or 5. 5. Now, what this lets me do is, it's not bound by a grid. The one over there is simply cloning based on coordinates. This one, however, it is cloning based on these little markers on each one, which will tell the computer what to do. That also means if I copied and pasted this room up one and changed the rarity and made a different room, that's all I need to do to add new rooms. These can be anywhere. They don't have to be next to the original dungeon like the first one was. Another challenge was the loot. How am I going to make a dungeon with a lot more loot that is more enticing while having more loot that feels random and out of place to give the dungeon more variety? The way I do that, if you haven't noticed, is through Bedrock. We chose Bedrock because Bedrock is one of the only few blocks in survival the player cannot naturally obtain, break, or change. That way, if the loot does fail, they can't do anything about it, but it also lets us find out what blocks need loot that is not in normal building, and what blocks don't. The loot also got a major overhaul. As you can see in front of me, there's a lot more loot than the version 1. The loot also has rarities. As you can see, this ground is common, we have uncommon, we have rare, epic, legendary, and mythical. This will give players more of a variety and see a lot more different loot in the dungeon as they're running through it. It also means that we can add a bunch more loot of each kind. So as you see, we have one of each kind of candle, and this is just making it more common, by the way. We have one of each head rotated in each direction, as well as one type of every leaf in each corner, stair, random floor loot, as well as random potions, spawners, barrels that have nothing, chests, new blocks, whatever you may need. This also lets us put more randomly generating spawners, which could be iron golems that are almost broken, could be cave spider spawners, villagers, blazes, whatever you may want. Now, loading all this was a challenge. This was one of the parts that I remember struggling the most on, because I need to make a dungeon that could load this really fast and into the dungeon. However, I think it's truly time to show what this beast can do. In front of me is a maze queued up. You might see difficulty 4 with a luck value of 50. That is not accurate. The difficulty is actually 300, loading the maximum number of rooms that this maze can load. I've done this through scoreboards. This maze tries loading and it predicts what difficulty is before any part of the maze loads and before anyone is actually running the maze. This lets me so when I want to re-roll, I can simply do that by just changing one item. And if I re-force the maze, it lets me load exactly what I want. Again, this maze has been forced to load the maximum numbers, and we'll watch that right now. What you see behind me is a 300 room maze. As well as this, you can see some key points on the top of this maze being a special room in the very top left, the spawn room, which is that green room, and the staircase, which is near it. When it was loading, you also may have noticed that a lot of things were happening at the same time. As it was planning the maze, it was also generating the rooms, and as it was generating the rooms, it was also generating the loot. Now from the boring maze that you saw before, I give you the inside of Dungeon V2. A more expansive and a more beautiful look to a maze runner. Dungeon V2 has way more traps, way more loot, and way more items than you would expect, and this will leave players for running this maze for about hours at a time. Dungeon V2 also has a system called a luck modifier. Dungeon V1 had a difficulty, but the luck modifier works a little bit differently than what you might expect. The luck modifier controls what kind of loot spawns into the dungeon. That, but also it controls what type of rooms spawn into the dungeon. Dungeon V2 has things called special rooms. Like Dungeon V1, special rooms are shops and other useful rooms that you can use during your exploration. But you might notice that Dungeon V2 has a lot more, 9 to be exact, with only 2 of them currently being filled, more on the way. It will add rooms that give a slight advantage during your running. The way Dungeon V2 decides if it loads these rooms is as it's mapping out everything, it's also remembering the endpoints. Just like Dungeon V1, as it's loading, it will load the endpoints in with an armor stand and memorize where it is. However, the difference is it's doing this while it's generating instead of at the end. Then, after it's generated, Dungeon V2 will get the luck value and compare it with the endpoints, and each endpoint will be assigned a value of its own. If the luck value is lower than the endpoint value, that means that the room fails. If the luck value is higher than the endpoint value, that means it passes. What this means is the higher the luck, the more of a chance that a special room will pass. Another thing this luck value changes is the loot. Every loot has a percentage of spawning in, and those are shown by these signs. As you can see, commons have about 70 to 100% chance, some being at 40. Uncommons are 40 and 30s, while the really rare ones are going down to 1% to 35s. However, this does not change how much loot spawns inside of a room. That room still depends how much loot will spawn. Back to the rooms in the loading section, each room has a number of bedrock blocks. Each bedrock block indicates one piece of loot that the dungeon can spawn. And as you see, there's a lot more than the original dungeon. Now, how do we get these bedrock blocks to be loot? The way I'm getting the loot into the maze is for each bedrock block, I'm actually filling it with a composter before anything else. Once it's a composter, I am then replacing that composter with air using the destroy command, or the destroy parameter on the fill command. This drops a piece of bone meal. Now, this entire system is checking for bone meal as it's loading the maze. It remembers all the bone meal in the world before the maze, so it does not target them, but any new bone meal that the maze generates, it will know to put loot there. Then, once it gets bone meal, it will then clone a random value, or get a random value on the loot table, and clone it in on that bone meal chosen at randomly. And unlike before, this one does it while the maze is generating. It does it all at the same time. Because instead of doing it all at the end where it's a big lag spike, I am compromising lag for generating the entire maze at the same time, but the trade-off is I can keep up with the maze as it's generating. The way I'm generating the room and loot rarities are the exact same. I pick a random piece of loot or a random room, and then I generate a random number. If that number is less than what the loot rarity is, it will pass the check and load it into the table. If it's not, then it will try pick a different room. This way, the lower the number, the more rare the loot can be, as the random number can be above it. Now for some of these things, it has other checks, like for the rooms behind me, when it randomizes a random loot rarity, it targets all of the rooms with that rarity or below. So if it's 50% rare, it will get every room that's 50% or below. So if the room rarity is like 49, it won't load, but if it's 51 to 100, it will. And then it just simply chooses a random one out of those. That's because I can't have loot fail as it's sharing the rooms, as I always need a room for every segment that loads into the maze. Now I want to go over how the rooms are actually generating, how the maze knows it needs to go to another story, as well as endpoints and special rooms. For this, I've jumped into spectator mode. And as you can see going through it, you can already see that the bounding boxes for all the rooms are still here. Every rarity in every room is still obtained and kept when it's generating inside the maze. When it's loading, you can see this by the rooms that are loaded ticking up slowly. But if it's in the maze, it will kill the room rarity instead of keeping it. That way it won't break the maze. Going under the maze, you can see a little segment of command blocks and concrete. This is the maze map. The maze map tells exactly what the director, or that low point of the maze that draws it out, should go. Following the maze map follows the exact same line that you see on the top. This line also tells the maze where it's already loaded, where it can load, and what it should load. For reference, let's look at this T right here. Going down to the maze map, you can see a command block facing this way, as well as 3 orange concrete. That 3 orange concrete is also following the T, and the reason that that command block is going this way is because if we retrace this way, it goes to where the staircase is. And that's because every command block will point to follow the start of the maze. Now, the way the maze learns that it needs to go to the next floor is when it's drawing on the start, it will simply generate the entire maze and then once it has no maze to draw back, it will first pick a random room to generate the staircase, and then once it generates the staircase, it will also pick random rooms to generate the special rooms. That way, the staircase is always priority. Once it generates the staircase, it teleports the marker to the staircase. So it would teleport up here on its director, which is right here, and then continue generating the maze like nothing happened. If you notice though, the staircase directors are still here, as they are kept in the maze, so the maze knows exactly what point of reference it needs to draw back to know that it is at starting position to start the next room. Another director that's kept here is the starting director. The start room director is kept, so I know where the players need to teleport into the maze to start it. Flying through, you might have noticed that there is other stands present in the maze. One right here, as well as more down here. What these are the end caps, because as it's generating the maze, it's also remembering where the end caps are again during the generation to save on generation time. After the maze has fully generated, that's when it assigns all these a random value that compares to the luck value, and if the luck value is greater than this value, it will know that this endpoint can be a special room. If the endpoint is a special room, it will replace the end cap that was loaded during the maze generation with a new special room generation. The special room generation are identified with little points of concrete that aren't built, but some of them are already done, and I'll do a quick sweep to see if we can find a special room with a structure. Here's the shop. So what happened when it was generating is it generated a normal end cap here. There could have been loot or not. And once it generated the entire maze, it got this end cap and decided that it won the gamble, so it loaded a special room being a structure. This also means though that these structures of the special rooms cannot spawn with loot inside of them. Another thing that this means is staircases, when they're going back, it cannot spawn with loot too. This is a bug I know, and I haven't quite fixed out how to do it because of the sequence of me loading in all the items. The way it loads the loot is when the director comes back and goes through, it will target all the loot inside the room and turn it to loot that the player can actually use. However, once it's here, it thinks it's already at the director, finished loading the entire floor, so then it moves on to the next floor. Another thing this maze can do is a dynamic reset. When I click the end, the entire maze disappears. However, that would be good, but this maze has a little trick up its sleeve. It's not a 10 by 10 or a 12 by 12 all the time. It randomizes those values. So if I start and re-roll the maze, as you can see we have 81, and if I confirm that, you can see this maze looks very different than the one before. It'll still generate, but it's leaving out log. Now this is because when I generate the points of where the maze can load in, so the grid right before you see the rooms, it gets the X and Y value, and it does some calculations where it teleports a armor stand down here at the home point, however many blocks it needs to go, by how long it needs to go, and same thing for the vertical. However, this is the exact same for unloading the maze. When I unload the maze, it gets the maze size and turns it bigger than the original maze, and then it clears it. The way it clears it is not by one giant fill command that might go out of the render distance of the player or the fill limit, but it actually generates the entire maze that it tried generating before with rooms, just with blanks. And the way I'm doing that is it actually fills in this entire corner of the maze first, the start room, with air, and then it clones that air everywhere in the maze. So when I click end, again it clones this with air, causing every part of the maze to also clone with air. There's also a lot of things with loading the rooms that you don't see while it's loading the maze. One of those is all of these have a wool block next to the rarities, and that's because the maze dynamically updates and checks for all the rarities before. Now, the maze, I said you could put this anywhere, and that is true. However, it is a defined spot. If I added a room right up top, it would theoretically work, but it would not load it because at the start it kills all of these armor stands and then reloads all of these wolves with redstone blocks back to wool to refresh all the armor stands again. This lets the maze also track what live rooms are currently in play. So if I want to disable a room, I could just break the wool block and it would never load. Or I could add it back and it would load. This also means that if I want to switch the rarity, I could go into the room, switch the rarity, and next time I load a maze, it would load with that rarity. That's all for now though. If you guys want to look at this map further, feel free to download it on my Discord server, where you can go and study the commands, change any of the rooms you feel like, or make it a fully fledged action adventure RPG like I was playing on at the very start. But for now, that's all I have to show you, and I am very excited to see what you guys create in the future.